I let my stepmother think she was inheriting my father's house, until she found out he'd left it all to me. The funeral parlor smelled like artificial flowers and grief, but all I could think about was how my stepmother kept glancing at her phone during the service. Dad had been gone for 3 days, and she was already making plans. I watched her from across the room, dabbing her eyes with tissues while simultaneously texting someone about paint colors and furniture arrangements. The audacity shouldn't have surprised me anymore, but it still made my stomach turn. She'd married my father when I was 15, swooping in like some kind of savior after my mom died in that car accident. Back then, I was too broken to see through her act. Dad was lonely, vulnerable, and she played that perfectly. She'd cook his favorite meals, laugh at his terrible jokes, and act like the perfect grieving widow to a man who wasn't even dead yet. But I saw the real her when Dad wasn't around. The way she'd roll her eyes when he talked about his work, how she'd spend hours on the phone with her friends complaining about living in his outdated house. The house that had been in our family for 3 generations. The house where my great-grandfather had built the wraparound porch with his own hands. The house where my grandmother had taught me to bake cookies in the kitchen that still had the original cabinets from 1952. The house where my mother had planted the rose garden that still bloomed every spring, no matter how much my stepmother complained about the maintenance. After the service, people started filtering back to the house for the reception. I helped arrange the casseroles and store-bought desserts, while my stepmother held court in the living room, accepting condolences like she'd been part of our family for decades, instead of just 8 years. I overheard her talking to her sister about how she was finally going to be able to renovate the kitchen and get rid of all those old-fashioned fixtures. The rage that bubbled up in my chest was so intense I had to excuse myself to the bathroom. That's when I found myself staring at the family photos, lining the hallway pictures of my parents' wedding, my first day of school, family vacations to the lake house we used to rent every summer. There wasn't a single photo of my stepmother in the bunch, and I realized Dad had never replaced any of them. He'd just added hers to the end, like an afterthought. Maybe that should have told me something, but I was too angry to think clearly. The reading of the will was scheduled for the following Tuesday. My stepmother spent the weekend going through Dad's things, making piles of what she wanted to keep and what she planned to donate. I watched her box at my mother's china like it was garage sale junk, humming to herself as she worked. When I asked if I could have Mom's jewelry box, she paused and gave me this look like I was being unreasonable. She told me we'd have to wait and see what the will said, but her tone suggested she already knew. I started to panic, wondering if Dad had really left everything to her. He'd been so different these last few years, more distant, more tired. What if she'd convinced him to change his will? What if I was about to lose the only connection I had left to my parents? Tuesday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching my mood perfectly. The law office was one of those old Victorian houses converted into professional suites, with squeaky hardwood floors and windows that rattled in the wind. My stepmother arrived wearing a black dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, her hair perfectly styled despite the weather. She kept checking her reflection in her phone camera and adjusting her lipstick. The lawyer was an elderly man with kind eyes who'd known my father since college. He offered us coffee and made small talk about the weather while we waited for everyone to arrive. My stepmother's sister showed up as a witness, along with my father's business partner and our next-door neighbor who'd been like a second father to me growing up. The formality of it all made everything feel more real, more final. When the lawyer started reading, my stepmother leaned forward in her chair like she was watching her favorite television show. The first part was standard stuff about debts and funeral expenses. Then he got to the personal items, and I felt my heart sink as he mentioned my mother's jewelry going to me. My stepmother's jaw tightened, but she didn't say anything. The furniture, the car, various household items, it all seemed to be going to her, just like I'd feared. But then the lawyer cleared his throat and said something about the primary residence and property. My stepmother straightened up, practically vibrating with anticipation. This was the moment she'd been waiting for, the payoff for 8 years of playing the devoted wife. I closed my eyes, not wanting to see her face when she got what she wanted. The lawyer's voice was steady and clear as he read the words that changed everything. The house, all 4 acres of property, and the small rental cottage in the back were being left to me, along with a trust fund I didn't even know existed. The silence in the room was deafening. I opened my eyes to see my stepmother's face completely drained of color, her mouth hanging open in shock. She started sputtering about how there must be some mistake, how she was his wife, how she'd taken care of him all these years. The lawyer calmly explained that the will had been updated just 6 months ago, and that my father had been very specific about his wishes. He'd left her a generous monthly allowance and some money for living expenses, but the house was mine. It had always been intended for me. The business partner later told me that Dad had confided in him about his concerns. He'd started noticing things, the way my stepmother talked about selling the house, her comments about how old-fashioned everything was, her plans to move somewhere more modern. He'd realized she didn't understand what the house meant to our family, and he couldn't bear the thought of it being sold to strangers. My stepmother left the lawyer's office in a fury, her sister trailing behind making excuses about emotional distress. I sat there for another hour, trying to process what had just happened. The lawyer explained the details of the trust fund. Apparently, Dad had been saving and investing for years, wanting to make sure I'd never have to worry about money. He'd been planning this for a long time, probably since my mother died. The next few days were a whirlwind of legal paperwork and logistics. My stepmother had to pack up her belongings and find somewhere else to live. She'd inherited enough money to buy a nice condo, but she was furious about losing the house. She kept calling me, alternating between tears and threats, trying to convince me to sell the house and split the money with her. I changed my phone number after the fifth call. Moving back into my childhood home felt surreal. I'd been renting a tiny apartment across town, working 2 jobs to make ends meet. And suddenly, I was rattling around in a 4-bedroom house with more space than I knew what to do with. The first night, I sat on the front porch swing that Dad had repaired every spring, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood I'd grown up in. It felt like coming home and losing everything all at once. I found boxes of things in the attic that I'd forgotten existed. Photo albums from before my stepmother, home videos of family vacations, my mother's recipe collection written in her careful handwriting. There were letters she'd written to Dad during their courtship, stored in a shoebox alongside ticket stubs from movies and concerts they'd attended together. I spent hours going through everything, crying and laughing and remembering who we used to be. The hardest part was realizing how much my father had hidden from me. He'd never talked about his finances, never mentioned the investments or the insurance policies. I found a folder in his desk with my name on it, containing copies of all the legal documents and a letter explaining his decisions. He wrote about how much he loved me, how proud he was of the woman I'd become, and how he wanted to make sure I'd always have a place to call home. He also wrote about my stepmother, and his words were more honest than anything he'd ever said out loud. He acknowledged that he'd married her partly out of loneliness, and partly because he thought I needed a mother figure. But he'd come to realize that she didn't share his values or understand what family meant to him. He'd tried to make it work, but in the end, he couldn't ignore the truth about who she really was. The legal battles started about a month later. My stepmother hired a lawyer and tried to contest the will, claiming Dad had been mentally incompetent when he signed it. She produced witnesses who said he'd been confused and forgetful, that he'd been taking medication that affected his judgment. It was all lies, but it was stressful and expensive to fight. I had to hire my own attorney and provide medical records proving Dad had been of sound mind. The case dragged on for months, and I started to understand why Dad had been so secretive about his plans. He'd known she would fight, and he'd prepared for it. The lawyer had extensive documentation of Dad's mental state, including signed statements from his doctor and several witnesses who could testify to his clarity of thought. My stepmother's case fell apart when security footage from the bank showed Dad clearly explaining his wishes to the notary. During the legal proceedings, I learned things about my stepmother that I wished I'd known years earlier. She'd been married twice before, both times to older men with substantial assets. Her first husband had died in a suspicious accident, and she'd inherited everything despite having only been married to him for 2 years. Her second husband had divorced her after discovering she'd been forging his signature on financial documents. The pattern was clear, and I felt sick thinking about how close she'd come to succeeding again. The judge threw out her case and ordered her to pay my legal fees. She disappeared from town shortly after, leaving behind a forwarding address in Florida where she'd apparently found another wealthy widower to target. I never heard from her again, but I sometimes wonder if her new husband knows what he's got himself into. Living in the house alone took some getting used to. It was too big for one person, too quiet without Dad's television shows and music playing in the background. I considered renting out rooms to help with the maintenance costs, but the trust fund made that unnecessary. Instead, I decided to use the space to honor my family's memory. I converted Dad's office into a library, filling it with books he'd loved, and adding new ones I thought he would have enjoyed. The garden became my sanctuary. I spent hours learning to care for my mother's roses, researching proper pruning techniques and soil conditions. I planted new varieties alongside the old ones, creating a living memorial that grew more beautiful each year. Neighbors would stop by to compliment the flowers, and I'd tell them stories about my mother and how she taught me to love growing things. I also discovered that the rental cottage in the back had a tenant I'd never met. An elderly woman had been living there for 15 years, paying rent directly to Dad's business account. She was a retired teacher who'd been quietly helping maintain the garden and looking after the property when Dad traveled. She became like a grandmother to me, teaching me family recipes and sharing stories about the neighborhood's history. The financial security from the trust fund allowed me to make choices I'd never had before. I quit the job I hated and started freelancing, working from home and setting my own schedule. I took classes at the community college, learning about horticulture and historical preservation. I even started a small business growing and selling heirloom vegetables, using techniques my great-grandfather had passed down through the family. As the seasons changed, I began to understand what Dad had really given me. It wasn't just money or property, it was the freedom to build a life on my own terms, in a place that connected me to my roots. The house held memories of 4 generations, and I was now responsible for carrying that legacy forward. It was overwhelming and comforting at the same time. I started dating again, something I'd avoided for years while working so hard just to survive. The trust fund took away the financial desperation that had driven most of my decisions, and I could focus on finding someone who shared my values rather than just someone who could help pay the bills. It was a strange adjustment, learning to trust my own judgment about people after seeing how wrong Dad had been about my stepmother. The house also became a gathering place for extended family and friends. I hosted holidays for the first time in years, using my mother's china and following her traditional recipes. My cousins brought their children, and the house filled with laughter and chaos that felt right in a way it never had during my stepmother's reign. We told stories about the old days, shared memories of my parents, and created new traditions that honored the past while looking toward the future. I found myself thinking about my stepmother less and less as time went on. The anger faded, replaced by a kind of pity for someone who'd spent her life looking for security in all the wrong places. She'd had the chance to be part of something real, to build genuine relationships and create lasting memories. Instead, she'd chosen to see everything as a transaction, every relationship as a means to an end. The house needed work, of course. The roof leaked during heavy rains, the electrical system was outdated, and the plumbing made strange noises in the winter. But I found satisfaction in learning to maintain it, in understanding how each system worked, and how to fix problems as they arose. I hired local contractors for the big jobs, but I handled the small repairs myself, feeling connected to the generations of family members who'd done the same. I also discovered hidden treasures throughout the house. Behind a loose board in the basement, I found a collection of love letters my great-grandparents had written during World War II. In the attic, I uncovered a trunk full of vintage clothes that had belonged to my grandmother, including her wedding dress from 1945. Each discovery felt like a gift, a reminder of the rich history I was now responsible for preserving. The neighborhood changed over the years, with new families moving in and old friends passing away. But the house remained a constant, a landmark that people used for directions and a gathering place for block parties and community events. I took pride in maintaining the gardens and keeping the exterior in good repair, knowing that it contributed to the character of the entire street. Eventually, I met someone special, a fellow gardener who appreciated the history and beauty of old houses. We talked about the future, about children who might someday play in the same rooms where I'd grown up. The thought of adding new memories to the house's collection felt right, like the natural progression of a story that had been unfolding for decades. Looking back, I realized that my stepmother's betrayal, as painful as it was, ultimately led me to a better understanding of what family really means. It's not about blood or legal documents, or who gets what when someone dies. It's about the connections we choose to nurture, the memories we create together, and the love we leave behind. Dad understood that, even if it took him years to act on it. The house stands as a testament to all of that, to the generations who called it home, to the love that filled its rooms, and to the hope that it will continue to shelter and nurture future generations. My stepmother saw it as just another piece of property, but I know it's so much more. It's a legacy, a responsibility, and a gift all rolled into one. Sometimes I sit on the front porch in the evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, and I can almost hear my parents' voices in the wind through the trees. The house creaks and settles around me, familiar sounds that speak of history and permanence. I know I made the right choice in fighting for it, in preserving what my family built over the course of nearly a century. The trust fund will eventually run out, and the house will need constant maintenance as it ages. But I've learned that security doesn't come from money or property. It comes from knowing who you are and where you belong. This house, with all its imperfections and challenges, is where I belong. It's where my story began, and it's where I'll write the next chapters of my life. My stepmother thought she was getting a house, but she never understood that what she was really after was a home. And you can't inherit a home, you have to build it, one memory at a time, one generation at a time. That's something no amount of money can buy, and it's something no legal document can take away. Dad knew that, and now I do too.